The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel welcomes back our guest, Ashok Panikkar, who is a mediator, teacher, and consultant with over 30 years of experience in cross-cultural diversity and conflict management. Ashok proposes democracy cannot be sustained outside of the West and that it is dangerous to try. Welcome, Ashok. Can you briefly explain this to our listeners?
Thank you for having me again. And, this is, perhaps it would help if I prefaced the answer to your question by saying that anything that I understand or know about democracy, any realizations that I have, come not out of scholarship, but out of my practical work for over 30 years in trying to establish, repair, and sustain democratic systems. So most of my work, particularly in diversity management and conflict management, entailed working with organizations, both small and large, corporations, NGOs also, and communities. And given that I did my work from the 90s onwards, and mostly in India and in the US, most of the organizations and communities that I worked with were emphatically democratic. So they're the ones who invited someone like me to come in and help them figure out how to iron out disputes, how to get back on track, how to ensure that they were more participatory. Just to be clear, I did have quite a few micro successes. And here's what I mean by that. Obviously, I wouldn't have lasted as a professional if I wasn't able to deliver. But in hindsight, most of my successes were in the moment. Working on conflict or issues related to stresses and strains on the system, I was able to help them resolve that at some levels and even attempt some form of systemic or cultural transformation. I say attempt. One of the things that struck me a couple of years down the line was that most of these systems went back to square one. And square one was usually extremely dysfunctional, particularly if you look at it in terms of a democracy, which is collaborative, participative, cooperative, fairly egalitarian systems. Many of them actually became autocratic. So when I talk about the fact that democracies cannot exist in many parts of the world, I'm really referring to the idea that it's one thing to set up democratic systems. In a nation or a country, that would mean electoral systems, checks and balances, institutions that can support democracy. It's one thing. That's difficult enough. But what helps sustain a democracy are not, unfortunately, these institutions or the electoral system. It is the mindset and the culture of its citizenry. Again, going back to my experience with communities as well as small and large organizations, I have often come across visionary leaders who were willing to invest enormous amount of time and money, particularly money, in trying to establish these systems. And they were able to inspire their staff or clients and the entire ecosystem. Unfortunately, nobody has figured out how to ensure that the democratic mindset can be scaled. So when I look at my own country, India, I was extremely fortunate to have grown up in a democratic country. Extremely fortunate, regardless of the fact that it was a very poor country. But starting in the mid 90s, it became clear to me that Indian democracy was flailing. And this was way before the Hindutva came to power. And the reason why it was flailing and failing was because the average citizen, and I would include civil society itself here, didn't seem to appreciate how tenuous our democracy was. The entire discourse had come down to how much we can grab for ourselves or our group out of the system. In other words, all fights were about the slice of the pie. And part of that, it's not just in economic terms, it's also in terms of what I call the inflationary value of rights itself and freedoms. Everybody wanted more rights, more freedoms. And I know this sounds like a conservative talking point, and I apologize in advance, but nobody, particularly civil society, worried about exercising their responsibilities. And this meant that the system depended on the politicians, trade unionists, the bureaucrats, and civil society leaders, all of whom had their own agenda. And that agenda was, how do I get the most for my people, however we define them to be? Not how do we simultaneously strengthen the system. So I'll stop now because I've talked for a long time, but I'm just scratching the surface.
A couple of questions, Ashok.
Yes.
When you say small and large, how small is small and how large is large? And where you say micro successes in the moment, can you describe those? And if you see like an ideal size for a democracy? Anyway, if you could expand more on those, I'd like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Happy to. The smallest organization that I was called into, and very often these mediation exercises kind of organically grew, mission creep, if you will, to include strategic planning and all the other things that were necessary to get them back on track. The smallest organization was a 12-person board of an NGO that I will not mention in New England. The average size of my organization was, of the organizations, my client organizations were around, I want to say 1,000 to 5,000. Okay. And the largest organizations that I was invited to in as a consultant were in excess of 100,000 staff. Okay, so that's in terms of this, my client base. But that's a great question that you ask. What is an optimal size? And I'm going to answer it in two ways. First, it really depends on the resources that we have. So in other words, remember, to sustain a democracy, as opposed to an autocratic top-down system, which you can have a dictatorship in China, the second most populous country. It's actually in a way far easier to run China with all its complexities than it is to sustain a democracy in Sweden. Okay, so the two factors that are vital are a very close alignment between the leaders. And when I say leaders, I don't mean autocratic, I mean visionary democratic leaders. That immediately narrows it down, okay? But because without them, you have no democracy. But there has to be enormous alignment between them and a critical mass of the citizenry or the staff. You cannot have all 340 million Americans equally aligned, even in terms of the democratic skills and dispositions. You can't. But you need a critical mass of people, or if it's an organization of the staff, who understand what it takes to maintain their relatively egalitarian system. Now, if you have that, it can be scaled to anything. And I just want to touch on something here and then I'll stop. What this means in practice, and this is what I've discovered, is that if you take a stable democracy, a healthy democracy, where you have a critical mass of people who are enthusiastic and capable of sustaining it, and the visionary leaders, and you increase diversity, and the people who join the system haven't bought into the democratic ideals or do not have the skills, that system is in trouble. So in other words, increasing diversity, which, I taught diversity training for donkey's years. Diversity is not the wonderful thing it is made out to be. Every increase of diversity increases the complexity, and all increase of complexity increases the resources needed to resolve the disputes that arise and sustain the democracy. So it's almost as though once you hit that sweet spot, you have the right mix, and if the system is working fairly well, it'll never be perfect, but fairly well, you have to be very careful in bringing in, say, a new CFO or a new staff faculty member, or increasing immigration without taking these factors into consideration.
So I think one of the benefits that we have here in the States that other countries who have tried democracy and don't particularly care for it don't seem to get is that the system is meant to fail.
Yes.
And fail or succeed slowly. and a lot of people can't deal with that. I'm trying to think of how this might relate to an organization, but I don't even want to go there really. We don't ask a whole lot of our democracy here. Our capitalism really holds sway. And so the rules play along as they play along. And the only time that you really get involved with it, I think from the standpoint of a democracy is to keep in check the capitalism, right? So, and it's mostly done through the court system where people go to court and fight for something, fight to stop something, fight to get remuneration for past sins or whatever, And so we ask our democracy very, very little, I think, other than just continuing the way we're going. And sometimes you do need to realign, as we've seen with various civil rights movements, women's rights movements, gay rights movements, where people who feel underserved by the democracy and are not fully participating perhaps in the enjoyment of freedom and the right to prosper, have to fight for those. And that's when you see these sort of dislocations, and again, it generally is slow. It's and I can certainly understand why people would want it to be fast, but it was not designed to be fast. It was designed to be slow, and it's designed, frankly, to fail and to be really difficult. I can see why other people in other societies don't like that, because you would want to catch up as quickly as you could to a society that is relatively affluent, seems to be freedom loving, gets along until recently fairly well, with exceptions, but nothing like what we're seeing right now, where about half the country thinks that this is a complete failure and wants to overhaul the entire system. I mean, what you're hearing now from Elon Musk and Donald Trump is they want to destroy the economy as we know it and replace it with something else entirely.
Yeah, I think that we are at a crossroads when it really comes down to it. American democracy has existed for almost 250 years, and we're beginning to see the chinks of the armor of American democracy. Society and civilization are great ideas, no matter what kind of system that you set up. Unfortunately, it's inhabited by human beings. And therefore, it will have the failings of the human beings that, first of all, create it, and second of all, live within it. Again, we're seeing that now. It didn't take much to upset American democracy. I can understand other countries not even wanting to, go through that process. Makes total sense to me. As we said before, the Russians gave it a shot when Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia, and basically the Russians didn't want anything to do with it. They said no, we want to be told that everything's okay and an autocrat works for us. And unfortunately, we're beginning to see that a democracy is no different than any other form of a governmental system. And we've been through a whole bunch. We've been from the dawn of time where you had family units, and then family units became villages, and then villages became, towns. And then eventually we had city-states, and then we moved to kingdoms, regencies and things like that. So any system we set up, no matter how good it may sound at the time, it's human beings that basically infest it. And everybody's eventually, you're going to run into somebody like a Donald Trump. You're going to run into an Elon Musk. You're going to run into these people that want to basically change the system for their own benefit. And that's human nature, unfortunately. And until humans evolve beyond these base instincts and these base activities that they engage into, I don't think you're going to find any single governmental structure, including in corporate America, just going back to corporate America, because let's face it, the CEO could be as democratic as they come. But if it's a publicly traded company, he's reporting to the stockholders. He's reporting to the board of directors. He can be as democratic as he wants to be, but it all depends on how democratic that other group who has a different interest, how much democracy they're going to allow him to to foster within the organization, especially if they see it hurting the bottom line. And this is the issue with any form of governmental structure. We cannot take the one factor that is unfortunately necessary for it. We cannot take that factor out, and that factor is humanity. And as I say, if humanity does not evolve beyond, me, my needs, unless you evolve beyond that, you're not going to. There really will never. Now, I don't know what the next form is going to be. Somebody's going to say it's the greatest thing since sliced bread for probably 100 years. Okay, great. I don't know, something that replaces democracy. But the fact is that it will fail just like every other system. It is why religions fail. Religions are there, in many cases, in organized religion, to basically control the mass. And then you had a guy, you had Christianity, you had the Catholic Church, and then this German, Martin Luther, decided that he didn't like it. And again, it threw a complete monkey wrench into the works and completely turned upside down what people thought was right for so long. And they decided that maybe Lutheranism was a better option. Who knows? But again, it's the same thing. We as human beings gravitate to larger structures of a civilization. We like to be in groups. For many people, they like to be a sheep, not the wolf, but you're always going to have the wolves, and that's where any of these governmental structures have an opportunity to fail. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Conflict Science. The JCIS is an open journal for upcoming scholars. The JCIS is currently accepting article submissions on an ongoing basis. The JCIS is a publication of Nova Works, a scholarly depository at Nova Southeastern University. A link to the journal is in our description. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, who is our editing partner, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. We'd also like to thank iHeart Radio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd also like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.